Hello, people. This is the first video in a series I'm starting called Analyzing the Golden Plates Eyewitnesses, where we will analyze every single eyewitness to the Golden Plates, including the 11 witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And so, the first video today, we are starting with Emma Smith, who is Joseph Smith's wife. Just as a disclaimer, I did do my best to be as honest to the source material and the arguments for and against Emma Smith's testimony, but being a fallible human and my own personal bias, which is that of a Mormon skeptic and Trinitarian Christian, might seep through. And so I also included a link in the description to a far more detailed script of this video so that you can look at every single claim I make and its source. So when it comes to the Book of Mormon, to Mormonism in particular, people usually fall into one of two camps: believers and unbelievers. And Emma Smith firmly stands in that first camp because she believed the book was divine until her dying day. But unlike the other witnesses in that camp, Emma provides a different kind of evidence because she's not like the three witnesses because she never claimed to see an angel, and she's not like the eight witnesses because she never did a formal inspection of the plates, and we'll get to them in another video. But instead, Emma is what we're calling the domestic witness because she had to live with the plates for years in her regular home life. And unlike her husband or other scribes, Emma didn't keep a journal during the translation years because we don't have a diary entry going back from like 1828 laying out like the day to day of what she did. So her voice is actually coming to us through accounts given decades later, mostly when she was like an old woman looking back. Research points to four main documents that contain her eyewitness testimony regarding the plates, and it is from these four documents that we can construct a general narrative of what's going on. And so I'm going to put the image of the subjects of the letters throughout the video so that way you know which sources I'm getting the relevant data from. All right, so the first part is like the harmony period. This timeline begins in 1827, where Emma Smith is 23. So after they get the plates in New York, Joseph and Emma flee from persecution to her father's farm in Harmony, Pennsylvania. In order to move the plates subtly, they were hidden in a barrel of beans to avoid detection by curious neighbors and money diggers. And so during this time period, Emma does not claim to have seen the plates on this journey. But once they get to the cabin, these unseen golden tablets basically become furniture. It's noted that they end up underneath her bed or sometimes are sitting on the table, wrapped in a linen tablecloth she had given to Joseph. So while the plates were under this tablecloth, she kind of claimed to feel the plates through the cloth. Some critics, not myself, would argue that the plates were just hypnosis from Joseph Smith, right? But if the plates were just a hallucination, then why did they need a heavy wooden box underneath the bed? Because you can't really hallucinate a 40 to 60 pound obstruction on your kitchen table, like continuously. So it would seem that this isn't really blind faith, but rather something tangible that Emma is kind of dealing with. And here I want to quickly touch on the material of the plates and what it was Emma might have claimed to have felt. Right? These plates were said to be made of gold, but pure gold is extremely dense. And if the plates were a solid block of gold with the dimensions described, they would probably weigh about 200 pounds. And so apologists argue that the plates were not pure gold, but actually an alloy known as tumbaga, which matches the weight and sound described. And so this is a gold, copper, silver alloy used in the ancient Americas that looks like gold, but it's kind of lighter. And a block of tumbaga plates would actually weigh about 50 to 60 pounds, which matches the witness descriptions, all right? But the skeptics, like historian Dan Vogel, have a different theory. They say that Joseph didn't need ancient gold, he really just needed tin. And she said that the pages rustled with a metallic sound and were pliable like thick paper. So tin does exactly that. So the skeptic would argue that Emma's sensory experience was real. So she felt the weight, she heard the rustle, but the object was actually a prop. But the apologist would hit back on this, because in order to fake this, Joseph would have to cut 60 sheets of metal, punch holes in them, and bind them with rings, all without his wife noticing, in a small cabin where she lived and worked, which kind of sounds like a risky art project to pull off. But it seems like this guy on Reddit seemed to recreate it in only a couple hours using like these ancient materials, like the kind of materials that Joseph would have probably used. And so did these non-Mormon YouTubers. So it kind of seems like it could be a possibility, like this tin theory. So based on Emma Smith's testimony thus far, here are some things that everyone agrees on. It wasn't pure gold because it was too heavy. It weighed about 50 pounds. And it rustled like pages. So you have to make the choice. Was it an ancient alloy that just coincidentally behaves like tin, or was it maybe a homemade prop that fooled his wife? And this is where we get into part two. There's a part of the Book of Mormon that we don't really have today called the Lost 116 Pages. Emma served as a primary scribe for the earliest portion of the translation work of this. In her 1879 last testimony, Emma was adamant that Joseph Smith had no books and no manuscripts. So, if he wasn't reading off a paper, how was Joseph Smith translating? So, according to an 1870 letter she wrote to Emma Pilgrim, the method actually evolved. She clarifies that the first part, which were the lost 116 pages, was translated using the spectacles, so the Urim and the Thummim. But after the pages were lost, she says he switched to a black stone placed in a hat to block out the light. During the actual translation process, Emma tells stories that portray her husband not really as a genius, but as an ignorant plowboy. Emma notes two incidents where Joseph Smith claims ignorance on certain issues while translating. First is the name Sarah or Sariah, and the second is the walls of Jerusalem. Okay, so the first one is the Sarah incident. Emma claimed Joseph couldn't pronounce the name like Sarah while translating and had to spell it out. Now, apologists often assume she meant Sariah, a unique Book of Mormon name, because it's hard to believe someone with a relatively Christian upbringing didn't know the name Sarah. But the record says Sarah, so we'll kind of stick with that. The second incident is the walls of Jerusalem. She said that while translating, he would randomly just stop translating and look up at her and ask if Jerusalem had walls. And when she said yes, he was like relieved and he was like, oh, I haven't been deceived. And then he would just continue with like translating. So, if you're an apologist, you might say that, hey, Joseph wasn't inventing the story because he didn't actually know how to pronounce the names and that Jerusalem didn't have walls, suggests that he was actually reading something word for word. And this is known as something called tight translation theory. Skeptics would say that, hey, this is a performance because it is highly unlikely that a man who grew up in the Christian faith in the 1820s did not know Jerusalem had walls. He did attend church, and it's reasonable to assume that from a young age, he did have a general idea of the biblical narrative. Therefore, it is certainly reasonable to believe he would have likely have known about the walls. The walls of Jerusalem are referenced all across the Bible in Psalms, 1st and 2nd Kings, Jeremiah, just to name a few. The entire first half of Nehemiah is about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So, by feigning ignorance, he sets a validation trap because he made Emma feel smart because she knew the answer. And he convinced her he couldn't possibly be writing the book. The same could hold true for the Sarah incident as well because he was just pretending to mispronounce a name that he made up that he kind of designed to sound kind of Bible-y, because Sarah has a very common biblical suffix, like Jeremiah, Nehemiah, Isaiah, Obadiah, like all these things that end in IAH. So this is the stuff that her testimony kind of covers, but this is where we have to get into the credibility of the testimony, right? So in February 1879, Emma is like mere months away from dying. She sits down for an interview with her son, Joseph Smith III. Now, Joseph Smith III is not a neutral journalist because he's the president of the RLDS Church, which is now known as the Community of Christ. He's fighting a massive PR war against Brigham Young and the Utah Church, and so he has two goals. One, prove his dad was a true prophet, and two, prove his dad never actually practiced polygamy. It's also important to note that the 1879 testimony isn't actually a private confession because there was a witness in the room. Major Louis Biddamon, who is Emma's second husband because Joseph Smith was like killed, and so she remarried. This guy was a total non-believer. He even chimed in at one point during the interview to like clarify a quick question. So Emma is saying this to a skeptic, her husband, and a believer, who's her son. And the interview covers two main topics, and this is where historians really have to wrestle with the mess, because the first is polygamy. Emma looked her son in the eye and denied it. We know today, based on overwhelming evidence, that she was lying. We have Doctrine and Covenants 132 verses 51 to 56, which takes place in 1843, where Joseph Smith specifically addresses her about it. We know she accepted plural wives like the Partridge sisters and then kicked them out of the house. She lied to the public record, period. And this isn't the first time she's lied in interviews about polygamy either. All right, she's done this in other interviews before, a lot. Check the script for more details. But then the topic kind of turns to the plates, and suddenly she doubles down, and she remains adamant that the Book of Mormon is divine. And so this creates the ultimate credibility crisis. The legal principle is falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. If this was a courtroom, her testimony would be entirely discarded because she's no longer credible. And this is where it gets dangerous for the historian. So earlier we talked about her sensory experience with the plate and how she felt the plates like through a cloth. Those details actually come from this very interview. So we're getting our best physical evidence for the plates from Emma Smith from the exact same conversation where she's actively perjuring herself about polygamy. And it's not just that, because she's consistently lied about her and Joseph Smith's knowledge of polygamy for decades across these multiple interviews. So the question you have to ask is, does her lie about the marriage invalidate her claims about the plates? Can you really trust a witness who picks and chooses what history to tell? Now, an apologist will tell you to look at the motives, right? They'll say, lying about polygamy protected her dignity, but lying about the plates, that just kept her looking like a crazy Mormon. If she wanted to be normal and fit in society, she would have just said it was a hoax. And since she didn't, the plates must be real. But that argument is a red herring, right? Think about who she was actually talking to in 1879. She wasn't giving an interview to the New York Times or trying to impress a banker in Philadelphia. She was actually talking to the Saints Herald, the official newspaper of the RLDS Church. She's being interviewed by a believer for believers. In fact, all of these interviews that she's done are by believers, except these two. So she doesn't have to worry about looking crazy to non-believers in an interview being published in an RLDS newspaper. Her son was the prophet of that church. His job, his income, and the entire movement depended on his father being a true prophet. So if Emma admits the plates were fake, her son's church just collapses, and he becomes the son of a con man. So I would say that she had a crazy, massive motive to lie, because it wasn't about looking sane to the world. It's about keeping her son employed and the movement alive and beating Brigham Young. Now, pretend Mormonism is false and it's all a lie. Did Emma know that the plates were fake? Was she in on the lie and bore false witness? Not necessarily, because her story about the plates did remain consistent for decades in 1856, 1870, 1877, and 1879. So if she is lying, she sticks to the script. However, she did also lie for decades about polygamy to more witnesses with a consistent story too. So honestly, it's certainly possible. But if you think she wasn't in on the con, then you have to accept the other option, that she was just fooled and she felt a prop. She did tell interviewers she never felt at liberty to look at the plates, so maybe that suggested she respected the cloth covering. Or maybe Joseph made it clear that there was maybe a spiritual penalty for peeking and looking. But in her private letter to Emma Pilgrim, she really does sound totally sincere, because she's not really performing for an audience, she is just writing to a friend. So I guess where does this leave us? After looking at everything, we are left with a testimony that is really muddy. So personally, I don't think she's lying. I could be swayed to think that she was in on it because she's like a constant liar across all these different interviews. But I do think Emma Smith definitely saw something. I think she felt the weight. I think she heard the rustle. I think she dusted around this object for years. And the reality is, she just never saw the plates uncovered. And the fact that Joseph kept them hidden under a cloth, even from his own wife who was scribing for him, is really sketchy. Because if you have ancient gold, why hide it from the person sacrificing everything to help you? Unless, of course, it wasn't what he was claiming it was. And so all she really proves is that she's an unreliable witness. So I'd recommend apologists stay away from citing her. Based on these testimonies alone, I would say the evidence points to a prop. Maybe 10, maybe not, that mimic the sound and weight described. And these stories of Joseph Smith stumbling over Sarah or Sariah or asking about the walls of Jerusalem, to me that feels less like ignorance and more like a performance that's trying to convince his wife that he's not a phony, right? So, do Emma Smith's testimonies disprove the Book of Mormon? No. Does she prove it? No. I think that she says that there was a physical object in the house and that she proves she was willing to believe in her husband. But belief isn't the same as seeing, right? To find out what actually was under that cloth, we have to look at the other witnesses. And don't worry, we will get to all of them. But if you think that there's anything I missed, anything I was wrong about, or just general thoughts, let me know in the comments below. But it's been real, it's been fun, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!